Ultimately, I think that Alberta must become independent from Canada. I know there's many people with emotional attachments to Canada, and I understand that. Like, historically, Canada has been one of the freest and most prosperous countries in the world. Like, Canadian military, like, it's famous for many, things that it's done. Like, they think of Vimy Ridge in World War I. The Canadian military is a proud institution, and it's done many things we can be proud of. And Canada, in the past, has done many things we can be proud of as well. But the Canada we live in today is not the Canada that I was born into many years ago. This country has changed. Yes. There's been many changes, and it's no longer easy to be proud of Canada like it was before. And the main person, I believe, who's responsible for this decline is a man named Pierre Trudeau, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Yep. He did many things to ruin Canada, and I just want to talk briefly about two things that he did that ruined this country. First of all, he made a severe attack on Alberta in the 1970s and 1980s, and then he introduced destructive changes to Canada's constitution in 1982. Now, it's very important to understand that Pierre Trudeau's attack on Alberta in the 1970s was unprecedented in Canadian history. It's not like the federal government, will attack one province and another province, and it's kind of Alberta's turn. No, the attack of Pierre Trudeau on Alberta in the 1970s and 1980s is unprecedented in Canadian history. It's never happened to any other province. Back in 1973, Pierre Trudeau introduced a federal oil export tax to take money out of Alberta. The money we were getting from our oil resources, because it was 1973 when the price of oil started to skyrocket because of a war in the Middle East. The federal tax on oil exports, it sounds like a pretty boring thing, something that's not very important, but it is very important because it was putting a tax on Alberta's resources and taking money out of Alberta. Premier Peter Lougheed at the time called it, quote, the most discriminatory action taken by a federal government against a particular province in the entire history of Confederation. That was our premier saying that in 1973. And in 1974, Peter Lougheed pointed out something that also very important about this export tax. In 1974, that's almost 50 years ago, that export tax on oil was taking out of Alberta between $800 and $1,000 for every Alberta citizen every year. That's in 1974 dollars, $800 to $1,000 per person. So if we converted that into current dollars, it would be more than that. But that was a huge robbery of Alberta's resources, of our money that should have been, for us and our children and not for the federal government. Now, that was before the National Energy Program. Of course, Pierre Trudeau brought in the National Energy Program in 1980. And the Liberals had a couple of public reasons as to why they brought in the National Energy Program. One was to achieve greater energy self-sufficiency for Canada, and one was to Canadianize the oil industry. Like many of the companies that operated in the oil industry were American, and Trudeau wanted to Canadianize it by bringing in more federal government influence. So those were the two major reasons they brought in publicly as to why Canada needed the National Energy Program. But it was just a smokescreen, because after the Liberals lost an election, in 1984, Brian Mulroney came in, and a couple of years later, the Liberal Energy Minister at the time of the National Energy Program, his name was Marc Lalonde. He was the Liberal Energy Minister who brought in the National Energy Program. A couple of years after they lost power, he admitted that those reasons they gave for instituting the National Energy Program are not the real reasons. And I just want to read a quote from Marc Lalonde a couple of years after they lost the election. This is what Marc Lalonde said. The major factor behind the NEP wasn't Canadianization or getting more from the industry or even self-sufficiency. So the two reasons I just mentioned to you that they gave publicly, say those weren't the real reasons. The determinant factor was the fiscal imbalance between the provinces and the federal government. Our proposal was to increase Ottawa's share appreciably so the share of the producing provinces would decline significantly and the industry's share would decline somewhat. So he admitted publicly that the purpose of the National Energy Program was to significantly reduce Alberta's share of its own resources. That was the reason that many Albertans thought at the time, but it wasn't the public reasons they gave. But afterwards, he admitted that the real reason was for the federal government to confiscate Alberta's oil resources, essentially. Now, the National Energy Program led to the loss of thousands of jobs in Western Canada. It led to numerous Western businesses going into bankruptcy. Many careers and families were broken, and home mortgages were foreclosed in large numbers. This was like economic destruction in Alberta from the federal government. In short, Pierre Trudeau unleashed a kind of economic war against Alberta from about 1973 until he lost power. Again, I just want to emphasize that this sort of attack on one particular province was unprecedented in Canadian history. Only one province in Canadian history has been attacked in this way. Now, even as Trudeau was attacking Alberta under the National Energy Program, he also had another major initiative, and that was to repatriate Canada's constitution from Britain and add his so-called Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, many Albertans have forgotten how much opposition there was to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Trudeau introduced it in 1968 when he was the Justice Minister. It took him 13 years to finally accomplish it because there was a lot of opposition to it, and a lot of opposition to Alberta. One of the leading opponents of the Charter in Alberta was a woman named Dr. Ruth Gorman. She was very famous in Alberta in the 20th century. She was a civil rights lawyer, and one of the things that she was most famous for was helping to get what was called the Indian vote in 1960. Like the Treaty Indians were not allowed to vote in Canada until 1960, and Dr. Ruth Gorman was one of the major lawyers who worked that so that they would get the vote like other Canadians. She was one of only 2 women to graduate with law degrees from the University of Alberta in 1939. Later, she became, like as I mentioned, a leading activist for the First Nations people. And in 1966, she got an honorary doctorate from the University of Calgary. In 1967, that was Canada's centennial year, she was named Alberta Woman of the Century. Like not Alberta Woman of the Year, but Alberta Woman of the Century. So when Pierre Trudeau repatriated the Constitution, Dr. Ruth Gorman got very involved in opposing the Charter of Rights. She helped found the Western Canada Concept Party of Alberta, which was, an independence party and won a by-election in 1982. She was one of the founders of it. She developed the Constitution and did much of its legal work. She traveled around the province giving speeches about why we should reject the Charter of Rights. Her main reason for opposing it was the absence of property rights. Property rights were deliberately omitted from the Charter. They were deliberately omitted. And she wrote in Calgary Herald in 1981, "Most countries lose these rights when tanks rumble across their borders. You are losing yours by a few pages of print." She went on, "Our ancestors came to this country because it was free. Our fathers, brothers, and sons fought for that freedom in 2 wars and many died. Westerners must now make another stand for their freedom, and you must do it now." Now, in spite of her best efforts, of course, Trudeau got his repatriated Constitution and his so-called Charter of Rights. So now we have a Charter of Rights that deliberately omits property rights. There are 2 main results from this. For one, protections of property rights in Canada are much weaker than protections for other basic rights. Secondly, restrictions on government power are less by conscious design. By refusing to protect property rights in the Constitution, it means that government power is not as restricted as it would be or should be under a proper Constitution. So you shouldn't expect that much from the Charter. This is Pierre Trudeau's doing. He permanently changed Canada for the worse, and it's not about to be fixed. But if Alberta becomes independent, we can pursue a path of prosperity without the federal government throwing obstacles in our way, and we can create a constitution that properly protects property rights. So independence is Alberta's best option. Now, during a naval battle in the American War of Independence, the British thought they were winning, and they called out to the American commander, whose name was John Paul Jones. They called out to him and said, "Are you surrendering?" John Paul Jones famously replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." And I think when it comes to Alberta independence, we should say, we have not yet begun to fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was great.